Hey guys, it's Villain Theory, and we have a brand new hero just announced today. I'm very excited to talk about Iceman. He looks very cool, pun intended, but also not intended. I'm really excited for this guy. I don't normally have the sort of deep dive videos out this quickly, which is ironic since I've kind of been away for a month and a half, minding my own business, and I was actually recording the podcast with Nelson today, and we're near the end, and he's like, yo, new hero just announced, and I'm like, what? We stopped recording that podcast real quick, let me tell you. But enough talk about that. Let's get into the actual look at Iceman. Now, before we get into any of the real detail about the cards, I've actually gone through every one of the cards revealed in the preview article, and I have looked through, counted the numbers. You can see there's a signature card number. They have, 15 signature cards normally on a hero. And there's also a unique design number, which is different from the signature count. If there's multiple copies of one card, they'll all have that same unique design number. And by kind of, comparing these two numbers, we can look through and I can figure out a lot of the card counts, even if they haven't explicitly told us there's, going to be two copies of this or one copy of that. And you can see the numbers here. I'll be mentioning them a little bit as we go through the video, but if you're interested, this is what we have. We're really only missing one card from his kit. Number 12, 13, 14, and 15. There's either going to be, a couple copies of Ice Blast, maybe three, and then two of another one, or three of another unrevealed card. We haven't seen a forwarding card yet, I'll just say straight up front. It's probably going to be that, but it does look like forwarding might be geared up to be his weakness, so it could be he's a bit like Colossus. He doesn't have a forwarding card, and we're going to get something else there instead. But that remains to be seen. He also comes with 6 set-aside cards called Frostbite. We'll look into that in just a second. But otherwise, this is what we have. We know pretty much his whole hero kit. So here we have Bobby Drake, that's his alter ego form, 4 recovery, a little bit better than 3. Hand size 6, and in hero form it's 5, so it's very standard. He has a mutant trait in alter ego, which is very good. A lot of good supports and things that run off that. And when the game begins, you need to find the 6 Frostbite upgrades, set them aside. And you can see that on the right side of the screen here. We have the attached enemy gets -1 scheme and -1 attack. It's a permanent upgrade, but it will be moving around a lot more than you might expect for something with that keyword, because it has a forced response that after the enemy activates or leaves play, set this card aside. So you're going to have many cards and ways that will make Frostbite attach onto an enemy, but then Frostbite will be removed from the enemy. Even though it says permanent cards can remove themselves, so that's kind of how that works. So Bobby Drake is set up to give the enemies some serious, icy, bad times. His alter ego ability is Cool Off, which is a response after you change that form, shuffle an ice card from your discard pile into your deck, and you get to shuffle an amount of ice cards equal to the amount of Frostbite cards currently in play. So if you've got a lot of enemies on ice, if you've maybe got the villain having several of these on because they can stack, you can then get a lot of your ice cards, which is almost all of his hero kit, back into your deck, which is pretty cool. Now, they're not, I would say, mind-blowingly strong. We will look through them. They're not bad either, though. But I don't think this is going to be an explicit, priority unless it's something you've really built around. But I do think it's pretty handy, and I do think it's cool how it interacts with the Frostbites. You're kind of trying to get as many out as you can before you go down, probably, depending on how many ice cards you actually have in your discard pile, because it's probably going to be possible to have more Frostbites out than you have in your discard pile. But yeah, kind of a cool ability. Nothing, earth-shaking, but I do like it. Iceman himself has a bit of a lower stat line, 1 fort, 2 attack, 2 defense. I would prefer if his forwarding was 2, but you can't have it all. It is pretty okay. It is what it is. Now, his defense is actually really free, and we can see this because of his hero ability, which is Freeze. That's an interrupt that when he makes a basic attack or basic defense against an enemy, attach a set-aside copy of Frostbite. It's an interrupt, so it happens before everything finishes resolving, so the enemy is getting a -1 attack when you defend, so effectively he's taking 1 less damage. That is pretty strong if you like defending. Now, I also think it's really good if you like attacking, because you can punch them in the face with a basic attack, give them Frostbite, then let's say you go alter ego, now they're scheming for 1 less. You're punching the scheme out of them. You can also punch the damage down, for when they attack you next. I think that's really fun. Makes readying really interesting with him. And obviously getting those Frostbites out from your basic abilities, excluding forwarding, that's going to be really good if you go alter ego and want to get those cards back in your deck. Forwarding really does seem like his weakness here. Ice trait, which is going to be good for team building exercise with a lot of his cards. X-Men trait, obviously very, very powerful. So he has 10 to 13 ice cards. Because we don't know what some of his cards are going to be, it's kind of up in the air. There's a very small chance it would be 9, but if he doesn't have 2 copies of Ice Blast, I'll be very surprised. We have confirmed 2 copies of Frozen Solid, which is kind of a defensive stun card. We'll look at that more soon. Snow Clone, he has 2 signature allies, very interesting ones too. They're 2 kind of normal attacks-ish. Ice War, which is an interesting defensive event. Really interesting Ice Upgrade, and then Ice Blast, which is kind of his area damage card. So he's got a very big variety of ice cards, which he can then get shuffled back into his deck, and like I say, use with team building exercise. And he actually has his own resource generator we'll look at soon, which helps pay for ice cards. Now, while I do like his alter ego ability, we have seen something a little bit similar recently, not too similar, but I thought it was interesting enough to talk about, and that is with Bishop. So Bobby Drake, he goes to his discard pile, puts ice cards from it into his deck. Lucas Bishop takes temporal cards from his discard pile, puts it in his hand. That's only one. Bobby Drake can get multiple, and putting it into your hand, putting it into your deck, those are very different things. But it definitely looks like in this recent wave, they're taking inspiration about moving things from the discard pile in different ways, especially with form changing. I thought that was curious, especially with traits that are unique to these heroes. And then we have those double signature allies, the Snow Clones, which is 2 cost, 2 attack, 2 HP. Kind of on the low side, but still good because 2 cost allies are just very good. He has the Ice and X-Men trait, just like Iceman. It's a clone of him, Cannot have upgrades attached. This is quite a downside, but if you see the rest of his text, you'll realize why that is very, very, very powerful if he could have upgrades, so it's probably a good thing he doesn't. Snow Clone takes -1 consequential damage after it attacks an enemy with Frostbite attached. So if you punch the villain in the face with Iceman, then your Snow Clone is not taking any consequential damage. That's kind of like Black Cat with Spider-Man, except you're dealing double the damage, which is pretty nice. Now, of course, you can't upgrade Snow Clone like you can Black Cat, and Black Cat also has an enters play effect that, can draw you cards. But I really like Snow Clone. I think you'll be able to get 2 of these out on the board relatively easily, and you'll be able to find lots of sources of Frostbite to keep them attacking repeatedly. So you'll kind of have this 2 attack every turn, more or less, for the villain, and sometimes for the minions as well. So that's going to be some nice pressure, and you can use them once, and they'll still survive, even though they didn't dodge the consequential damage. So a little bit of flexibility there, which is really nice. And that X-Men trait is going to be really handy if you play in leadership. So then we can look at the way he deals damage. Now, we've just looked at Snow Clones. I put them here as well. I think they're going to be really a steady source of damage and good to finish enemies off that survive, that you've attached Frostbite to through other means. Arctic Attack is his main attack card. 2 copies of this, it looks like. Deal 4 damage to an enemy and attach a set-aside copy of Frostbite to it, or deal 6 damage to an enemy with Frostbite already. Now, for 2 cost, it's an okay card. I think 2 cost for 4 damage is on the low side, but if you consider Frostbite might make an enemy deal 1 less damage, or scheme for 1 less, almost 1 threat removal in advance in a way, it is a pretty good value. Now, that is mainly going to be if you hit the villain. If you hit a minion, minions don't typically survive very long. It's unlikely you're going to get a huge amount of value off Frostbite unless it's a very big minion, in which case that is pretty useful. But generally, I think you're going to use the top option on the villain, or the bottom option, honestly, kind of on the villain, or if it's a very big minion. I do think you can use this on normal enemies. 2 for 4 isn't terrible, but it's kind of more what you'd expect to see at the, an aspect level rather than a signature card. So mixed feelings on that. I like the card. I just don't think it's super powerful, although the attack, ice, and superpower trait does mean it will work with things like martial prowess, it will work with team building exercise, it'll work with Death Focus and X Gene. So it does have a lot of ways you can pay for it, which is probably why it's costed how it is. Ice Blast, I really like this card. It is choose a player, attach a set-aside copy of Frostbite to the villain and each minion engaged with that player, then deal 3 damage to each enemy with a copy of Frostbite attached. Now, if you notice the wording here, you attach Frostbite to those enemies engaged with a player of your choice, but you deal the damage to any enemy with Frostbite attached. So you can punch the minion in front of you, then choose another player and we're playing fantasy games now, use Ice Blast on that player's board, and you'll not only add Frostbite to those and damage those, but since you've already got Frostbite on one of the minions in front of you, you'll get to damage that as well. So I really like that. I think that's going to lead to some kind of fun sequencing, fun little puzzles trying to spread the frost out before you kind of detonate the Ice Blast. So I like this card. Again, not sure it's super powerful. If you have 1 minion in front of you, it hits good damage, and Frostbite on the villain is pretty handy. But you really want 2 minions to be hit. If you can get Frostbite on other minions, for engage with other people than the person you choose, definitely elevates this card. Gonna have to see in practice how good it really is in the long run. And yeah, that kind of forms the basis of his attacks. None of these are bad, but all of them kind of have a a hoop to jump through. You want to get frostbite on the enemy, or you might not benefit from the full frostbite if you defeat that enemy, before that gets triggered. Ice Blast, it's gonna be scoring a little bit low on damage if you only have one minion being hit. Snow Clone, I really, really like this. It's just gonna have to, if you don't have Frostbite on the enemy, it's gonna be a little bit dodgy to use it. And then I just want to talk about how Ice Blast is kind of reminiscent of Blast of Wind from Storm. I thought that was interesting. I assume this is intentional kind of mirroring because they're both blasts. And it's just choose a player, deal 3 damage to all those characters. It's kind of the kind of through line here with this theme. I thought that was interesting. I'm not sure if they're going to continue this in the future. I don't know if there's even any characters that it would make sense for, but I did like this. So I thought that was worth sharing as well. So next up, we have kind of the more defensive options. We have Frozen Solid, which is kind of his version of Webbed Up. It's a free cost upgrade. I think we all kind of expected something that was going to freeze an enemy very directly. Hero form only attached to an enemy. When an enemy would activate, discard Frozen Solid instead. So this is a stun that works on Star War enemies or bypasses steady, however you want to say it. Functionally kind of works very similar, but it is free cost, which is very, very expensive to stop one activation. In general, I'd actually like to stop 2 activations for this. We can look at Shadowcat's Phased and Confused as a good comparison. However, this does then attach a set-aside copy of Frostbite to that enemy, which I don't think it makes it worth the cost, but it is a nice sweetener, so that's pretty nice. Then we've got Ice Wall, which is a 4-cost support. Very expensive, very, very interesting card, very unique. As players, I don't think we've ever had a card quite like this. It's almost like, okay, it's a little bit like Phoenix's telekinetic shield. So the way this works is that you put this in play, then as a force interrupt, when an identity would take any damage from an attack, an enemy attack, you place that damage there. And placing damage there is very interesting. So the damage is still kind of happening, but it's not happening to you. It's going there. And it's discarded if there's 8 or more damage there. But the damage doesn't go anywhere onto you or anything like that. So if you have 7 damage on this card, and then you take an attack, and who knows, maybe you were playing Venom, you stacked up boost cards, he's dealing 20 damage to you, Ice Wall will absorb all of that. It will take all 20 damage, you'll discard it, the damage will go with it, you're completely fine. So you're going to want to manipulate the amount of damage the villain does to try and make sure you get an extra, lot of soaked damage from this before it goes away at the end. Ideally, I think you'd want to block 3 attacks with this. In Standard, I think that's very feasible, maybe even a 4. In expert mode, especially against 3 attack villains there, which is quite common. It's going to often only block 2 attacks. Of course, Frostbite is going to make that a lot easier. But, if you're using Frostbite alongside this, it's kind of the value of Ice Wall is kind of being propped up by the value of Frostbite. So you cannot kind of evaluate that in a vacuum. It is the value of Frostbite, you're getting a lot there as well, but still pretty nice. I still think I would play this from time to time, especially if I haven't got a better target for team building exercise than that, especially if the team is maybe running a little bit low on damage mitigation. So I like this card, very, very interesting. Then we have Ice Slide. So this is his first upgrade we're going to be looking at here. This boosts all of his stats and gives him the aerial trait, which is insane. When me and Nelson saw this, we could not believe it. It is a very, very good card. It does have the downside of forced response that if you go Ultra Ego, you must shuffle it into your deck, which, at least it's not discarded. It's back in your deck, so you can find it again. But I think, even though Bobby Drake has a very interesting Ultra Ego ability, if you have this card in play, I don't think you're going to really want to go Ultra Ego. I think this card is too good to try and, give up willingly. I think you want to try and keep it. If an attachment says you have to go to Ultra Ego to remove it and it's really prohibitive, you need to do that, okay, fine, ditch Ice Slide. It's not going to make or break your game, probably, but it is very nice to get those stat boosts. So I think once I play this, and I think I do play it almost every time I see it, I try not to go Ultra Ego, using all that damage mitigation that comes with Frostbite to stay hero form and not have to heal or anything of the sort. And then we have his last 2 upgrades, which are really good, especially the one on the left, which is Cryokinetic Perception. Not the easiest card name to say, but a very good card nonetheless. 2 cost, superpower traded, very nice. Hero response, after you resolve your freeze ability, exhaust this card, draw 1 card. Well, you're going to be basic attacking or defending basically every turn. His low fort's kind of seen to that, unless you're really in, a bind if you really need it. So this is kind of 1 card draw every turn for 2 cost. That's huge. I mean, okay, maybe you'll recover as well, but again, he's got all that damage mitigation. I think you're going to try and avoid doing that too often. Yeah, getting this card draw for that cheap is really, really good. And on top of that, it can ready you up. If the card you draw has the ice trait, you get to ready Iceman. Now, with about 10 to 13 of your deck being ice, you maybe got maybe a 25% chance, maybe a bit higher if you start to thin out your deck. Kind of depends how you build it, and it will depend, we'll have to see quite how many he does have exactly at the end when we know all about his cards. Yeah, this card is just really, really nice. I think it's really going to be satisfying when you get that ready up. It's going to feel really good. It's going to be a bit like when you hit jackpot on Domino. You get that big bonus out of nowhere that you probably were hoping for but weren't expecting. I'm really looking forward to that. Power Bout is a 2-cost upgrade as well. You get +3 hit points, so it's kind of like endurance, but then it also has an extra bonus where it works as a resource. You exhaust it, it generates a wild resource for ice cards. So it's only really good for cards in his own signature kit, but there are a lot of them with ice, like we said, probably 10 to 13. So it's going to have plenty of targets. You should hit this, I would say, on 80 to 90% of turns, especially if you thin your deck out a little bit with some upgrades. If the game goes on long enough for a second time for your deck cycle, that's going to be very, very good. And it has the item trait, which is meaningless, but it has the tech trait, which is very, very useful for a certain little protection card called Repurpose, which we'll be coming to later. And I think that's a good time to dive into the aspects with him. Now, I think Just Ice is going to be a really useful aspect for him. I don't think it has a ton of synergy with him, but I think it shores up a lot of his weaknesses because he doesn't have a lot of thwarting, it seems. So if you're playing in solo, you'll have, a good bit of damage, plenty of, survivability, but keeping this threat under control could be where you run into trouble, and that is what Justice will solve. What I think is also interesting about Frostbite is the timing. It falls off after the villain activates. So if you stun the villain, or if the villain's going to scheme, if you have them confused, that will block them activating. Your Frostbite gets to stay on for longer, which could be beneficial. And you have various ways to confuse and even stun if you upside the head twice here in Justice, which I think is interesting. Now, since he is weak to thwarting, I do think in solo play, Global Logistics, which I think it's a bit of an underrated card. It's one of my favorites. In solo play, you're going to be able to use this to dodge any encounter cards which are going to give you trouble. So any side teams coming up, any kind of advance maybe, you can just use Global Logistics to kind of tweak that, shuffle around the cards, and make things a lot better for you. So I think that's going to be very good. And then we have a few other cards which I thought had interesting interactions. Now, Marvel Girl is interesting because when she attacks a minion, you remove threat equal to the printed scheme on that minion. And because it's printed scheme, you can freeze that minion with, Frostbite, and its printed scheme won't have gone down, just its, actual active scheme. So she's still useful against them. No massive strategy there. I just thought that was a cool interaction. Foiled, I think, is really fun for Iceman. Now, I would like to mention the web in this picture. Maybe it's actually a kind of, ice reaching out, freezing his hand. But it's an interrupt that when a boost card is turned face up during a scheme activation, you get to cancel its boost icons. So it's kind of half a confuse, but it's an event that you have to actively use. In solo play, this is, almost useless. People think this looks good, they will try it, and it will rarely get played. It's a lot better in multiplayer, but generally still doesn't always make the cut, especially because it's, unreliable if when the villain schemes, if it's even going to be a high boost card. But since you're using your kind of ice cards to reduce the villain scheming a lot, Frostbite is going to reduce their scheme potentially to 0. The confuse is, it will preserve them, but you can just use up the Frostbites and then use Foiled, and potentially, even though you didn't confuse the villain, they're now scheming for 0. I think that's kind of a cool interaction. Next, we've got Float Like a Butterfly, which I think is really interesting. If you're not going Alter Ego, maybe you're trying to keep that ice sliding, your stat boost upgrade in play, you can just keep those confuses on the villain, and, even without that, you can still make good use of Float Like a Butterfly, but you can just leave those confuses there. Then you and your snow clones can keep attacking and keep getting the benefit from Float Like a Butterfly. Get that extra 1 attack on potentially 3 characters, potentially readying up with your cryokinetic perception. I think that's pretty fun. And then we've got Justice Served, which is going to be a fun little card. Let's say you put that in play. You can attack the villain, put a Frostbite on them with your freeze ability, maybe use an event to clear a scheme. Then Justice Served can ready you up. You can attack again, and then put another Frostbite on there. I don't really know if it's fully worth it for that, but I thought it was a fun interaction and way to ready in Justice to get more out of his freeze ability. Then we have Aggression, And I think he's going to be really interesting in aggression. I think there's a reason he was printed in it. At first, I was a little bit surprised, but actually, I think it makes a lot of sense. You're going to be able to use Icy Blast to put Frostbite on minions, and then they'll deal less damage to you. You can kind of keep them around a little bit longer, which is going to make Bring It really useful, which is going to make Frog trigger more often. And you can, of course, use Looking for Trouble to bring extra minions out, and then, Ice Blast the board, which I think is going to be very satisfying. Not necessarily sure that's going to be the best strategy to bring in minions. It will depend on the minions in the scenario. But I think this is a really fun kind of way to use Iceman's ice abilities. It's kind of reminiscent of Blizzard with Storm. We can also then use Get Over here because he can get aerial with this ice upgrade for some reason. Um, I think that's going to be really fun. So you can use Get Over here to bring people to you in multiplayer. Also, Shutterstar can do very similar. Gather everyone up on your board, then you can use Icy Blast to hit every one of those minions at once for free damage. Very fun. And again, Angela is a bit like Looking for Trouble. Good ally that will bring in a minion that you can blast down as well. So you can kind of lean into some area stuff and some gathering enemies up. So not sure that's going to be, again, the strongest build, but I think it will be very fun and satisfying. And then we've got Shark Girl, which is one of the new cards they've just revealed today. When she's attacking an enemy, she gets +1 attack for each upgrade attached to that enemy. So if you have all 6 copies of Frostbite on the villain, you are going to be having Shark Girl deal 8 damage, which is absurd. You can put attack training on her because she's an X-Men ally. She's got extra health. You can do that, so you get multiple activations of that damage. Going to be hard to set up. Going to be very satisfying. Regardless, still going to be very, very good. You're probably getting 3 to 5 damage, no problem, off Shark Girl as Iceman. Very, very cool. Then there's Surprise Move, which is the other new card. When you make a basic attack against an enemy with an upgrade attached, you get +2 attack. So if the enemy already has Frostbite on them, now you're getting +2 attack. If you get to defeat them, you ready your hero. This card is really, really good. A ready normally costs 1 in Marvel Champions, so to have a readying card cost 1 and give you +2 attack is excellent. Now, you do need to defeat the enemy, which unfortunately means you either have to do the exact right amount of damage or waste the damage, and then, then you'll get the ready. It's going to make it hard to use on the villain and get full value. I do still like this card. I think it's going to be useful. I don't know if it makes every deck, but it stacks again with Shark Girl, and that can only be a good thing. And of course, we have Battle Fury here, which readies your hero with the stat boost from his ice upgrade, and potentially other stat boosts, and then readying potentially from his cryokinetic perception. I do think you can, do a few kind of readying build, stat boosty builds, which I think could be fun. Don't know if I love Battle Fury with him, but I wanted to shout it out. Shark Girl, though, absolutely amazing. Then I want to talk about, if we're trying to preserve Frostbite for Shark Girl, we can look at the ways that aggression can stun the villain. We also have Mockingbird in basic, but critical hit, which is one of the new cards, and Dropkick are going to be really good for this. Dropkick will be better if you can find the physical resources. My only concern is a lot of Iceman's cards are targeting the villain anyway for maximum value from Frostbite, and then Dropkick is as well. It could leave, and Shark Girl is going to want to then attack into the villain too with all those upgrades on the villain, which is going to make minion control a little bit difficult. So I don't know how this will work out in a practical setting, but there's definitely a lot of damage potential here. And of course, with the aerial trait, we have a Dive Bomb we have to talk about. Hone Technique is absurd. It is a very, very, very good card. And will it be good for Iceman? Well, as an X-Man, he can get the X-Jet, which means he can certainly find mental resources. And if he can get aerial, he can Dive Bomb. Now, I don't typically love Dive Bomb in solo play. I don't really love it all the time in characters that have to try and go aerial by putting some kind of card in play. Especially in this case, the card can be removed if he has to go Alter Ego. However, due to the traits on that card, it's actually a little bit more likely than you think. There are a couple of ways he can get it into play, which means Dive Bomb becomes that little bit more consistent to get online. So I think that's going to be fun. We do have the new card Take That, which can only deal damage to an enemy with an upgrade attached, but Frostbite, that's going to be fairly easy to find. So Take That is going to always be ready to use. With Hone Technique, that's going to be dealing 10 damage, so that's pretty crazy. And of course, we have Boot Camp for your snow clones. Just giving them plus attack, getting to use them almost all the time, with no consequential. I think this could be very strong. And of course, other X-Men allies are pretty good as well. So you can go into a very kind of maybe ally-oriented build, or at least somewhat, and gets a lot of benefit from this, which I think is fun. Then we have Protection. Armored Vest is going to be really good. So we talked about how he has that 2 printed defense, but because when he defends, he puts on a copy of Frostbite, he really kind of has effectively 3 defense. With his ice upgrade, he's going to have basically 4 effective defense. And then with Armored Vest, it's going to be 5 effective defense. That is huge. Just for a 2 cost upgrade and a 1 cost upgrade, that is, Iceman is going to be very strong if you go into protection. He's not going to be taking much damage whatsoever. Combine that with, more copies of Frostbite, at least 1 or 2. Yeah, really, really good. So Unflappable is going to trigger ultra reliably. You're going to stay pretty healthy since he has a health boost on his power belt. Dauntless then can become a pretty good card. If you've lowered the attack value of minions, maybe even let them attack into you, get some retaliate onto them. So I thought that was a fun little combo. You can also go for readying because he gets that stat boost from that ice, sliding upgrade. He can then use the stat boost for things like what doesn't kill me, ever vigilant if he becomes aerial, which is absurd, and that will give him some nice threat removal for the main scheme, and also repurpose. And that power belt does have the tech trait. Now, ideally, I don't think you want to repurpose it, but if you can end the game with the extra damage from repurposing it, of course, why not? Exhaust it as a resource, then repurpose it, ready up with a nice stat boost. I mean, what's not to love? I think that's very fun. And you can even use that when you're in a pinch if you have to. You might as well try not to lose if you're in a losing situation. Sacrifice that belt. But yeah, I think that's gonna be really fun as well. So I'm very excited for that. I love a repurpose. Then if you want to try and keep those, frostbites on the villain, you've got tackle, you've got iron fist, you've got ways to stun the villain so they don't activate. So frostbite remains in place. Doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of use for that unless you want to go ultra ego and then draw more ice cards from your discard pile to put in your deck. But we'll see how effective that is. We don't know what his last card yet is. I kind of feel like because of the way some of these cards costed, it's not super competitive. I wonder if those cards are going to have a really big payoff for having multiple frostbites on the board, which would then make these kind of cards to stuns, confuses more desirable. So we'll have to see, but I thought it was a fun interaction that needed to be highlighted. And then we have leadership. Now, leadership has some fun stuff here. Caliban will help you find your snow clones a little bit quicker, potentially, which I think is a fun interaction. Domino, which is something Nelson pointed out to me on our little live reaction here, you could use her to swap an ice card on top of your deck, then use your cryokinetic perception card to, when you draw a card, now you know you're getting an ice card, you're going to guarantee to get that ready. I think that is really, really good. So Domino is going to be very powerful in Iceman, unless maybe you're building into a certain trait, maybe X-Men, but we'll come to that in just a second. But maybe she's worth including anyway. I've not exactly done the maths here, but getting a card out of that guaranteed is really very good. Ready for Action I thought was really interesting here. This is an underrated card that I've been wanting to talk about a bit more. I think it's often forgotten about. Allies, cheap allies are so good, it's often forgotten. But something you can do with the pull aspect, if you're, say, a hybrid character, a multi-aspect character like Spider-Woman, you can have these allies which don't take consequential damage and then put tufts on them to use when you need. You just kind of store them on there. And that's something you can do with Iceman snow clones. If the snow clones have -1 consequential damage if they're attacking an enemy with frostbite, they're not taking any damage from attacking, which means if you've put a tough card onto them, it just sits there. So you can kind of bank a tough card on one of the snow clones, or even if the scenario has some anti-ally tech, if an encounter card comes up, it might say deal 2 damage to the lowest health character, or deal 2 damage to an ally. This will help keep them alive, and you can bank a spare way for them to defend you and stay alive in the future as well, which is really, really useful. So I think that's fun. Don't know if it will be competitive enough to earn a deck slot in very kind of try hardy, really very serious decks, but I like that a lot. And of course, if you're keeping these snow clones out, not taking consequential damage for quite a long time, Band Together is going to be online basically all the time, and you'll get a lot of resources. So I think that's really cool as well. Then we have the X-Men stuff. Uncanny X-Men, that will reduce the cost of your snow clones, and it's just kind of a busted card, If you can play multiple allies on one turn, it's basically generating you multiple resources because you're getting that discount on each X-Men ally, with each one you play. But even without that, you're still getting plus, you're getting +1 health as well. It's team training and an Avengers Tower with multiple uses. It just doesn't have the expanded, ally slots. But fortunately, Utopia is also super powerful and provides that. So X-Men builds are going to be doing very well on Iceman, like they do on basically every X-Men character. Now, what's going to be very, very good on Iceman, and I think must have been designed with Iceman in mind, is Mirage. Mirage is one of those cards that I've wondered, why did they print it like this? It just seems very weak compared to most other, leadership allies that we tend to get. A lot of the allies in Storm's pack, except Pixie, just seem to fall a little bit on the weak side, and I was like, why? That doesn't seem, in standard play, I suppose Mirage hits a bit more often, but in expert play, you know, it's not often you have an enemy with less scheme than she has thwarting, which is what you need to stun them. Now, with Frostbite, you can lower their thwarting stat, so she's going to be able to stun them very, very easily, basically on any difficulty level, which is really, really, really good. And of course, with things like Make the Call and Pixie herself, which, kind of synergizes with Uncanny X-Men, you're going to be able to keep playing Mirage, keep getting some stuns. So if it does turn out there is big benefits from his final card for keeping Frostbites in play, that's going to be really useful. But otherwise, still going to be very useful to help protect the team. I'm really looking forward to doing that. I think X-Men leadership for Iceman is going to be phenomenally strong. And then we have the basic cards. You guys know the drill. X-Men cards on an X-Men hero. It just makes so much sense. They are just so powerful. And if you don't have enough Frostbites out to shuffle all the ice cards you want back in, Mutant Education can maybe provide that. I don't know how essential that's going to be, but I thought it was, interesting. X-Jet, very, very good. Utopia, we've already talked about how big his stats can get. So readying, Iceman is going to be very useful. And of course, any good allies, everyone's always going to want, and Angel is certainly a very good ally. Then we have some more kind of, maybe generic cards you could put in maybe a non-X-Men deck. Professor X is X-Men traded, but, everyone loves Professor X. Here, the Ready is really useful. The Confuse is, of course, really useful. But all these cards here, except Team Building Exercise, which we've already kind of talked about, that's really good for his ice cards. Deadpool, Spider-Man, Professor X, and there are a few other basic allies that are good for this. All good for thwarting, all good for threat removal, which appears to be his weakness. So then we have Hope Summers, who I really like. After you play Hope Summers from your hand, search your deck for a superpower card and add it to your hand. So although you'll be hard-pressed to play it that turn, you can use her to find your Ice Slide card, which will then, enable you to have Aerial, give you all that boosted stats. I think that's very strong. And since it gets shuffled into your deck a lot, if you go Alter Ego, it's guaranteed. You'll be able to use her to find that no problem. So I think that's really interesting. Superpower Training is going to be good as well. That can get his Cryokinetic Perception or his Ice Sliding card. So I think that's going to be very useful for him if you can find the threat removal. Especially in multiplayer, though. If someone else is bringing it, you're going to really benefit. Then we have Specialized Training, which, we've already talked about how big his defense can get. You can make it even bigger, but you'll probably use this more maybe for attack or maybe even in solo, maybe threat removal. Not really sure, but definitely a strong option for most characters. Iceman is no exception. If you can find the threat removal, it's really going to depend what that last card is, quite how, accessible this benefit is. But in multiplayer, if someone else is bringing this, if they're helping maybe forward it for you, that's going to be a huge boost when you get it. Then we can talk about X-Gene and Death Focus. I think these are both going to be good for him, but right now he kind of has a borderline amount of cards I would want for Death Focus, so we'll have to see how that works out in the long run. But thought they were worth mentioning, a bit like how I mentioned them with Bishop. And that brings us kind of to my conclusion here. Now, he has plenty of damage cards, but they'll have those, those little loopholes, maybe they're not ideal for hitting minions. Maybe you need a certain amount of minions out to really make them worth playing a lot, So I put his damage at 3. I don't think he's going to struggle for damage, but I don't think he's going to feel in any way like a really high damage character. I don't think you're going to be, amazed by, how all the enemies are just falling over before you. He's just going to be okay. Thwarting, he's got 1 thwart. We haven't seen a single thwarting event. His signature allies, both of them, neither of them can thwart. So, yeah, that's looking kind of rough. Yes, he can get 2 thwarting with his Ice Slide upgrade. Yes, he can potentially maybe ready up with his Cryokinetic Perception. I'm definitely getting better at saying that. So it's not like he doesn't have any, but it's really not reliable, and he definitely doesn't start very strong, Let's say you start against Expert Venom, there could be a side scheme with 8 threat. Yeah, you can damage to lower that one a little bit, but, point stands that thwarting is going to be very tough for him at the start of the game, unless there's something we haven't seen yet. So Justice is definitely going to be a very strong candidate for him for solo play. Survivability looks really good. I was almost tempted to put a sort of 6-star here, the bonus purple star. You guys might see that I use in some of my videos, just when someone goes above and beyond. I do think Frostbite is really good. He does have a couple of copies of Frozen Solid, which stop attacks, but they're really expensive. I don't think you'll be playing them a ton of the time, and when you do, that's going to come at the expense of other things. Frostbite, yes, it's going to lower the enemy's attack, but it doesn't completely nullify it, so you need to stack several of them, or you're going to have to exhaust the defend on top of it. And if the villain then attacks again, you're not going to have any stacks of, Frostbite left on them. So very, very strong defense, I think. Especially because, Icy Blast can throw out Frostbite on a bunch of enemies, so he can kind of, lower attack on minions too. But I don't think he's quite comparable to characters like Colossus, where I did award the, extra star to. He's not got, double tough cards. He doesn't start with 14 hit points, even though he can get there, which is kind of crazy. But yeah, very strong survivability though. 5 stars, very, very good. Economy, I think, is surprisingly good. I can't really believe he's got that 2 cost card that will draw a card basically every turn. I think that's very strong. Don't have much more to add to that. He's got the power belt as well to generate resources for his events, which I will like. So yeah, pretty nice. With being an X-Men, he has access to all the X-Men stuff. We talked about X-Jet, maybe Death Focus and X-Gene. So yeah, he's got things going for him. Team building exercise with the ice stuff. So I don't think you'll feel like you'll struggle to afford things with him, even though a lot of his cards maybe trended to a little bit more of the expensive side. Certainly doesn't seem to be running a lot of 0 or 1 cost cards, put it that way. Still very strong. Control is surprisingly low. He does have that ice, frozen solid card, which will kind of, effectively stun the enemy. Really, really good that works on stalwart enemies. Really going to be good for, people with the Infinity Gauntlet. That will stop the Infinity Gauntlet from actually triggering, especially, Thanos, who's always stalwart, very useful. But, other than that, his other cards don't really offer what I consider control. You're still going to be getting boost cards from the villain, even if they've got so much frostbite on them, they're not actually damaging you. So he's not really controlling the villain. He's just got that survivability. I should say, which I didn't mention for survivability before, he does have the Ice Wall card, which I really, really like. That leads us to reliability. Unfortunately, we've got Arctic Blast. You might not have Frostbite in the right place. It might, not be the kind of value you want otherwise. You've got Icy Blast. If you don't have enough minions out, it's not going to kind of pay up enough. Your Ice Wall, you could take a really big hit and actually only block maybe 1 to 2 attacks with it. If Ronan hits you, maybe you just block 1 attack. That's so expensive for that. It is not worth it. There's just a few, I've said this before, hoops he has to jump through for some of his things. Some things have to, kind of line up. His Ice Slide upgrade, so strong, but if you get an attachment that says you have to, go Ultra Ego to remove it, and otherwise, it kind of ruins your whole game plan. Things can go a little bit wrong with him. So I'm not quite convinced on his reliability. I think he's got a lot of good cards, but you're going to have some obstacles and careful placement of them to make them work. So I don't necessarily know that every Iceman game will go as smooth as the next one. Hope to be wrong on this, though. I hope to bump this up. I do really like the look of him and moving those frostbites around. I think that's super, super fun. Card value, I've put at 3. Some cards I think are really, really good. Some cards I think for slightly short of what I would, expect. I'd expect more for what I'm paying. Upgrades I think are very good. Some of the events and bits, pseudo events, the consumed upgrade. Yeah, it's just all right. So overall, strong, good, but nothing to write home about. Ease of play, I think, will be at 3. At first, I thought putting these frostbites around was going to be very difficult, but since he doesn't seem to really have huge motivation to keep a lot of them in play, I think you're not going to have to worry about that too much. You can just consume them, let yourself take less damage. I think that's going to be absolutely fine. So yeah, I don't think he's going to have a ton of different deck builds. He's just going to have kind of the normal amount, which is nothing wrong with that. But I do like Iceman a lot. I've made it sort of a rule so far not to guess Hero's fun factor because they're not out yet. I don't think that's fair. But I am extremely excited for Iceman. I think the idea of freezing these enemies, building up Frostbite is really, really cool. So I'm very excited. I don't think he'll really play too much like any existing hero. I think if you like to use basic activations, I think that's going to be fun. I think if you like to kind of line things up, that's kind of going to be fun. It's kind of maybe a hint of Cyclops without the kind of ally focus, although again, leadership will be good for him. Getting those upgrades out. It's a little bit like exploit weakness, but in reverse. It is the practice defense cards. You're going to be able to put a lot of those kind of cards out. So if you enjoy weakening enemies, he's going to be a good hero for you. So where does this leave him overall and my prediction for the tier list? This is just a little bit of fun. He's not out yet. I have not played him, but I am estimating the B tier. Now, when I've said B tier for characters before, people have been like, whoa, what's wrong? But B tier is good. B tier means they're a solid, strong hero. B tier is where most of my favorite heroes live. It is kind of they're strong enough to be really competitive and feel like they're contributing a lot, but they're not too strong that they're making the game too easy. I actually really like the challenge level that characters in this tier kind of fall into. So I actually see this as kind of the best thing for me. I would love it if he actually turned out to be B tier, but I will, try and give a fair review to him when he's out and I have actually played him. I think he is a little bit lacking in damage, very lacking in forwarding, which tends to hold heroes back. That reliability, I'm not sure if it's there. If you actually count the amount of stars I've given him and compare it to my tier list I've posted on YouTube a couple months ago, I think he kind of has more like high C tier stats, if I'm honest here. But I do think the X-Men trait, I do think how cool some of these interactions are, I do think it might just elevate him enough. And maybe I'll be surprised. Maybe he'll work his way up into the A tier. But what you guys have to realize is that the X-Force heroes were very strong. The previous X-Men heroes were very strong. Magic is definitely looking like she'll be very strong, which means the tier list, it gets harder and harder to get into those higher tiers. The high tiers right now are so competitive. So B tier, I think, is a really good placement for him, and I'm excited to play him. Let me know what you guys think. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you want to see more. I'll be looking into the aggression cards very soon, and maybe even a quick little talk about the modular set. Not sure yet. That comes with Iceman as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.